Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HPL Gallery's Artist Talk series. My name is Jennifer, and today I'm so thrilled to introduce to you artist and educator Barb Bondy. Barb utilizes an inquisitive scientific framework to approach her practice, and she merges conceptual art and drawing in this way that's very lovely and labor intensive. So with that, I'll leave it there and turn it over to Barb to further introduce herself and to share her work with us. Thank you so much for doing this today, Barb. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you to everyone for listening. What more could an artist ask for than an audience and someone who's willing to listen to the ideas? So I thought I could show you my website and sort of walk through my website and give you an idea of what the scope of my work addresses and what I've been doing for the last 2 decades. How does that sound?
That's great.
Okay, so I'll share my screen. So this is my website. What I think I need to tell you from the onset is that my work centers around this idea of metacognition. So I've been interested, as I said, for a couple of decades on this idea of metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. And I use science, mathematics, art, and the humanities, sort of an interdisciplinary approach to my work to sort of think about, draw connections, and think about how humans live and experience the world. I'm interested in the workings of the human mind. And I use things like tracking, tracing, measuring, documenting, various approaches to my work. And I thought I could talk a little bit today about how metacognition, thinking about thinking, manifests in the work, and how the work is project driven for the most part. There are some diversions every now and then. And also the prevalence of the grid, using the grid in my work and how I use it for various reasons to get you thinking about sort of the discourse of the idea behind the work. And Rosalind Krauss wrote an essay in 1979, and she referred to the grid as anti-natural, anti-mimetic, anti-real. And she notes that the grid crowds out the dimensions of the real. So I find it very exciting how I can use the grid as sort of like a substrate for my work. And anyway, I'll show you a little bit about that. It's probably better to just show you through the work. So this is my website, and it as well is designed on a grid. Grid being the vertical and horizontal coordinates, which James Burke has a quote where he said that by gridding the world, we have gridded ourselves and there's no place to hide anymore. And I like that idea. So we're kind of locked into the grid. So it's valid in our time that we live in. So there are various projects here. If you scroll over, you might get some text. But these are different projects that I've worked on, most recent work and work that goes back 10 years. And I've divided my website into the projects. So I've spent a lot of time on the topography of sleep, for example. So what I did here in this project is, we all wake up one morning and you look at the sheets in your bed, right? And it sort of looks like mountains and valleys. If you're really close, you're lying in your pillow, and that's how you see it in the sheets. And so that sparked an idea in my mind to start thinking about, well, first of all, where do we go when we sleep? Where does the self go? Because we leave our state of consciousness, right, when we sleep, and then we wake up in the morning, and I'm always delighted to wake up the next day and know I made it through the night and it's a new day. And as well, I also like this idea of maybe using sleep as a way to be productive. Could I also work in my sleep? So I worked with Chris Mixon, He's actually a cartographer at Auburn University. And I asked him, is it possible to create a map of a bed? And we worked together on this project. So what I did basically was I slept on a bed, a cot, and the next morning when I got up, this is the end result right here. This green image is actually a map, and it follows all the cartography conventions. But what I did was I woke up and I created a pin and thread grid over the entire bed surface. And I took almost 3,000 measurements every half inch. And I provided that information to Chris Mixon. And we used ArcGIS, which is a geographic information system. And out of that came a production of a map of a bed, a topography of sleep. And so what this did was it layered together on the grid the materiality of the bed that we all sleep on, and this idea of where's the existence of the self, and a lifetime of a human being compared to maybe the lifetime of mountains, which take millions of years to form. And even just one night of sleep is something to think about if you contrast the two, how mountains form, how we live in the spaces we inhabit, the time measurement of one night of sleep in comparison to the geological time is interesting to think about. And of course, it just led me to think more about where do we go when we sleep. So I also followed through with another project where for 7 days I slept on a pillow. And you can see over here, I slept on the pillow, and the next morning and all day and night, I drew that pillow to sort of mark the location of where my head rested, when I slept. And it was sort of a verification of where I was. And I did that for 15 days. I only took 7 out of it for exhibition purposes, but 15 days, it was quite grueling knowing that I would be drawing for almost 14 hours and then having to sleep on this again and start all over the next day. So this is another series I did here where I actually photographed, if you can see here, I photographed from above the bed I slept on for 30 days. And what that ended up showing was the patterns of body movement. It was rather interesting. Each of these projects gave me more information and helped me understand a little bit more about humans when they sleep. Let me just jump you forward here. This is a new series, Deep Seeing it's called. So I'd read a study not that long ago. It was written by Irving Biederman, and he wrote conducted a study called the recognition by component theory. And it's how we see, basically. And it's a long and thorough study dated 1987. And of course, it's been updated since then. But he had written a recent article about novel experiences and how if we're looking for pleasure when we're looking at things, and we seek pleasure, we seek patterns, and the longer, this is really in a nutshell, but the longer we engage in the observation of something and look at something, the deeper it goes into the visual pathway in the brain and embeds ultimately in memory. So with this series, what I did was I took pieces of information that's available in the public, like everything from error messages to scanning codes to weather maps to all kinds of information, photographs, and I just broke them apart and reassembled them, hoping that the viewer would get a sense of something, feeling of recognition, but not sure what they're looking at. And these, by the way, are 22 by 30 inches. And I like to show more than 2, ideally 4 in a row, so that I can try to capture the viewer's attention while they're trying to sort out what it is they're looking at. And in this process, it is my hope that while I created the drawing, I do think somehow, I have not been able to prove this, but I feel that I'm embodied in that drawing while I'm drawing, I'm thinking, and somehow I think I get entangled in the drawing cognitively through thinking. And then when the viewer looks, if I can hold the viewer long enough, I use the drawing as a lure, like a gentle, friendly lure to lure you in. And hopefully, if that drawing or those images do go down the visual pathway and embed in memory, I'm thinking that we're all entangled cognitively. And I think that's a really exciting idea. Now, this drawing on the left here, this is just thinking about the anatomy of a thought, how messy it is, and how thoughts begin and stop and start and generate new ideas. And it's actually an infinite process, I think. If you think about the thoughts you had this morning, where did they go? Are they layered under other thoughts? Have they been revised in all your recalculating throughout the day? What does that look like? So I do spend a lot of time also trying to make visible that which is invisible. So also I've got drawing series and projects here. So I did say that, I'll just jump over to this for a minute. I do have these other series of works where I like to play. And I like to do things like challenge myself physically, or try again to make something visible, or have a little bit of fun. And I call it the work effort subset series. So it's really about human labor, because I worked since I was maybe 12. I've been working, doing some kind of labor, bussing tables to picking berries and so forth. So I do enjoy the physicalness of work. And in this case, what I did here is I actually laid out a long strip of paper on the floor in my office, and I coated the wheels of my chair with graphite. And as I wheeled back and forth, doing my work, I captured it on a piece of paper. So it's kind of an attractive piece. And this is another piece here beneath it, where I actually just used a copy stamp, and I repeated it over and over again until it became an original using the copy stamp, which I thought was kind of funny. So let me get back. Now, this is another series. This one goes back a ways, the intractable series, I call it, because I'm thinking again about how once a thought is released, it's out into the world, it heads toward entropy. For example, you cannot refreeze a thawed ice cube. So I think about thought in those terms too. And here I actually use, again, physics. So the second law of thermodynamics is used in this drawing. It's called dissipation and flow. And what it basically says, and I use it at its most basic level because I'm not a physicist, that isolated systems evolve toward thermodynamic equilibrium, which means the state with maximum entropy. So I tried to relate this or use this as an analog to think about thinking. So this was the dissipation and flow. And to the right of this piece, it's called timeline. So these are actually graphite pencil refills. There's almost 2,000 of them. So what I'm thinking about here is, well, first of all, my idea drives the form. So in this case, I had to use a material to convey the idea. And I was thinking about how infinite the process of thought is. And so I used these pencil refills because I was thinking about, as the tip of the pencil scrapes across the surface of the paper, if you're doing calculations or drawing, and that material sort of drags across the paper with the thinking as well and the calculation, there's a lot of power in just one pencil refill. So here I just want the material to come as close as possible to floating in space. And it serves as a metaphor for the intangible, non-visible, interwoven structure of thought, all kinds of thought, which is what I was trying to show as well in the newest work, The Anatomy of a Thought. Over here to the left, I'll just show you a couple more things here. Over to the left, this is called the Diagram for All Solutions. This goes back a long ways when I started thinking about thinking as the subject matter of my work. And what I did was I created drawings that were trying to I had to develop symbols that worked with making thought visible. And so these ideas are all different. What I tried to do was to put myself shrunken down into the synaptic gap where some might say that's where information is modified. And so to me, that's a little playground for thinking and drawing. And so this particular drawing is trying to convey the feeling of what it feels like to think about if you were explaining a rock to a rock. How would you explain a rock to itself? And I'll show you something on the beginning page when I said I do like to have a little fun. I found another good example that this drawing led me to think about as a result of making the drawing. So this series of 60 drawings, it could be anything from paying attention to too much coffee. These are some of the titles that I remember, but the overall series is called The Diagram for All Solutions because thinking is always behind the solution. So that's that series. Again, this is spread out over decades. There are some examples of exhibitions. I was fortunate to work with Jennifer and Ground Floor Contemporary to have an exhibition titled Thought Experiments, which is actually what my work is. They're thought experiments or they're propositions when I'm proposing an idea. And so it's really exciting to be able to have an exhibition that starts putting all the work in context with itself. So you see maybe work that spans over a number of years or even decades, which is what has occurred for me very fortunately in the last few years. And then I think before I go back to the homepage, I am involved in a research project with collaborators, Jeff Katz, Dr. Jeff Katz, a cognitive neuroscientist. And over here is Margaret Forloin, and she's now at UC Davis, she's a director of the Alzheimer's Center, I believe, and Lily Strasberg here. And we worked together for a number of years, and in a few words, what we did was we scanned the brains of students before they learned to draw and then after they learned to draw. And we also scanned in the later part of the project a group of students called the control group who had no intervention with the arts or drawing, so that we could contrast what we found with the two groups. And what we discovered down at the bottom, you can see this is all the areas of the brain that were activated in the drawing students only. And we developed the tasks. So the students were scanned in an fMRI machine. They had to lay down and they'd press a button to answer the questions. And what they would be looking at, their head was in a helmet and, so they couldn't move. And they would do these 10 rotations of questions for each task on each a different concept of drawing. And so you can see there were 4 concepts, but these 3 specifically showed a lot of activation. And some of those areas are kind of exciting. We discovered areas related to attention, decision-making, motor control, top-down control, where you're learning, you're using something that you've learned to problem solve, visual information processing and working memories, all these working memory. These are all areas where the brain was activated. And we had a chance to present this with Renee Fleming, who had come to town at Auburn, she has her own series called Music and the Mind, which is really very interesting about the impact of music on the mind. And there's less research on the visual arts and specifically drawing and how that affects the brain. So we were very happy to be able to contribute to this body of knowledge, although I'm sure it's like a grain of sand on the beach when you start thinking about how much we don't know about the brain. So I just wanted to point this out here. This was a rock I'd found, a beautiful rock found on the beach. And beside it is a chewed piece of gum. And I titled this also Explaining a Rock to a Rock. So thank you very much for listening. Feel free to visit my website. It's barbbondy.com. And thanks very much for listening. I appreciate it.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay. One reason that I really respond to your work is that you operate within the regions of conceptual art, but have remained devoted to the act of drawing. And this merging of conceptual art and paper-based work is so unexpected with the prevalence of video, installation, sculptural. So would you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the act and the process of drawing and what results occur for you when you engage in a labor-intensive process? And I feel like you kind of touched on this, but I wonder if you'd go a little bit more in depth about your thoughts on like the act of drawing.
Thank you. That's a good question. So let me just jump to the latter part of that, the labor-intensive process, because that's significant to me. And I do remember when I was in graduate school, and I remember getting advice. In fact, this may even have been when I was doing my BFA, and it came up again with my MFA, that I didn't feel like I had worked hard enough to get the product at the end. Even though it was successful from the viewer's perspective, I didn't feel satisfied. Like it just felt too easy. And so the advice I was given was do 100. So I tend to do labor intensive work, and I'll do something over and over again, not in an obsessive way, which is a term that's often used. And I don't think it's a very flattering term, because it's really a sustained gesture. And because there is a lot of thinking in that process, and there is a lot of self in that process that has to unfold. So I think that's very important. When I do a lot of my drawings, the newer work, I hand draw the grid. It's a very tiny grid. It's a rectangular grid, by the way. The artist Agnes Martin said that she was famous for her grid paintings, and she said she felt the rectangle grid was nearer to perfection than the square grid. And I discovered that I agree with her. It just seems more affable and friendly than the square grid. So I hand draw the grid, and that alone is very satisfying. And I also think about it as the substrate for thought. It holds in my thought, it locks me in. It's gridlock of thought. And then it also becomes this discourse for critical discourse, talking about where is the self when we sleep, for example, or what does thinking look like? And then as far as the way I work is, first of all, they're thought experiments or they're propositions, being analytical. And so I use drawing because drawing is my form of expression, just like a poet would write. I can think in more complexity when I draw, and I avoid language. So that's the way I choose to communicate. And also I do straddle, what conceptualism or conceptual art may push against is aesthetic or material concerns, but I actually apply them. If I can lure someone in because they think something looks interesting, then that's one way to hold the viewer. And so I try to work on multiple layers and levels. And then again, the works are analytical. They are intending to propose questions or, like I said, critical discourse. Mm-hmm. So that's how I've worked for all these years. It's very satisfying. It's more like philosophy to me.
Well, I really enjoy it a lot. So this has been great. Oh, great. Wonderful. I just really enjoyed your talk, Barb. I just can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to share your work with us. I mean, it's such a gift. So I genuinely thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you. And thank you to all the listeners, because that really is, I think about what do I want to get from my work? I don't pursue fame, and I'm not trying to make fortune, a response. So I think, to me, if I can get a response from a viewer, I'm excited because the work has done something. And it also, if it quiets the questions for me, then that's when I know it's done. So thank you very much for having me. It really is an honor.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, and to the audience, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.